put it in what was so called uh, 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 um, and also ignores having a passage that would link West Bank and Gaza that should be the real embodiment of that geographical unity, and only allows a secure passage under the mercy, mood, and the determination of the occupier. This preamble of geographical unity is manifested into separating or disfiguring this geography into A, B, C, and this defect that hit the Palestinian brain um, uh, was manifested in deciding or discussing the settlement, which is the core of the Zionist project, until a time that comes for the final status solution. Without this defected political brain, even stipulating signing the Oslo agreement in the White House garden with freezing the settlement, just freezing the settlement, while the partner of that piece of the brave, Ishaq Rabin, who our leadership prayed so much for the mercy of God on his memory. Regardless of not stipulating in that cursed agreement, stipulating the release of prisoners, just like other liberation movement that do not really forget its prisoners, and without allowing anyone to describe the hands of their militants as stained with blood. So, and without even this defect is also manifested in this tragic comic that is called coordination, secret coordination. Have you ever heard that international liberation movement coordinates have security coordination with its enemies? Um, uh, this defect was also attached with another symptom, which is no less dangerous. That is the loss of determination, loss of will, despite all the indicators and events that showed to the failure of this Oslo track and the dangers of continuing in that track. There is no real and serious determination to change this track and to take another alternative track with all the momentum that is needed. Hesitation and waiting are still dominating. We did not take a decisive decision towards Oslo agreement yet. We did not take a decisive decision towards the security coordination yet. We did not decide our decision. We did not take our decision towards the futility of the international court, despite the fact that it is fully submitted or under the submission of the Israeli will and conditions. We did not even take our decision regarding the impermissibility of going back to negotiations before we gather all our means of strength. Because we should not enter any negotiation, should not enter any such negotiations without gathering our powers, even if it was in a French apparel or rather a French trick, because it aims at stopping the momentum of BDS, and it will lead to full surrender. It is not permissible to go back to the negotiations at a time when we are weak and at a time when we abandon our elements of strength ahead of time. Otherwise, these negotiations will become either full submission to the dictations of the strong, or will become futile negotiations, fruitless, except that it gives the Israelis the time needed to complete and deepen their Zionist settlement colonization project, and gives them and provides them with a cover to that protects them from the condensed pressures to end their occupation. A third symptom of our morbid state of morbidity is losing the vision and insight and losing the compass that defines the directions and priorities. Proof for that is the fact that this division is destroying us and incapacitating our capacities to face the challenges and risks. And despite that, we don't take one single real step to end this occupation with any price. And we don't really put that on a daily basis on the top of our priorities. Knowing that the first serious and real step that should be taken in that direction is should be invested in the immediate call for the convention of the temporary leadership framework of the PLO. This intransigence, this insistence on putting a veto against the convention of the temporary leadership framework is not understood, is not justified, and it is impermissible to continue despite the fact that because this framework forms the first step that is inevitable in order to go towards ending the occupation on the one hand and to rebuild the PLO on new bases on the other. So simply and clearly, and I can say so simply and clearly, I can say those who reject or impede the immediate call for holding the temporary leadership framework, in fact, they reject ending the occupation and reject rebuilding the PLO. Those who reject or impede the immediate call for holding the convention of the temporary leadership framework, those reject the ending the occupation and rebuilding the PLO. This loss of vision and loss of the compass is manifested in this accelerating going down towards dictatorship, despite the fact that on a daily basis we see the consequences and results of the destruction of the dictatorship regimes around us, as if we are needed to swim all the time up the stream at a time when we see this stream is destroying systems of dictatorship and totalitarian systems. So we see that this dictatorship system is infiltrating among us. So what can we call the monitoring kind of behavior on the security agencies on our life, what we call the retreat of independence of judiciary and its integrity, what can we call the retreat of freedom of press and the subjective censorship on the press to please the security and civilian authorities and even the capitalists sometimes. What can we call the indicators that really focus the three authorities together and the accelerating absence of the separation of power? What can we call the absence of the clear and categorized decision making? What can we call that skeptical look and inimical look, sometimes ebbs and flows towards the establishment by the since the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority towards the civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations? And what should we call this? Ever since the establishment of the PNA towards the civil society organizations and its non-governmental organizations and mixing the good and bad together, which leads to undermining one of the main three pillars of any modern society. For in addition to the three powers, the executive, legislative, and judiciary as powers, as authorities, there are institutions. There are three institutions in any society: governmental institutions that work on the margin of the executive authority, that has an advanced role in providing and developing services. Among these institutions, there are good institutions, there are bad institutions. And of course, there are civil society organizations in any society. And these societies are responsible and active in all walks of life. And among these institutions, there are good and there are bad institutions. And also, there are the private sector institutions. There are some that are good, that abide by the societal responsibility, and there are some who are only abiding by the profit making as their main value. So distorting the look towards the civil society organizations across the board and without any discrimination, and mixing all these things without any controls and standards will really lead to undermining this main pillar in our society, especially for us Palestinians, whose civil society organizations played an advanced and main and pioneering role in facing the occupation, challenges of development, and steadfastness under the occupation before the inception of the authority, decades before the inception of the authority until this day. Ladies and gentlemen, if all this is not sliding towards dictatorship and totalitarianism, so what can we call it? So in our session this morning, there are three distinguished speakers. We all know them, and I believe their interventions will put our conference within its serious context from the very first moments. And I will start with Dr. Georgia Kaman, the director of Mواطن and philosophy professor at the Birzeit University, to talk to us about the unspoken about in the Palestinian society. Maybe I mentioned some of those things that are unspoken.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. Dr. Mamdouh raised the level of my expectations because it is difficult to reach this level. And he also spoke before me about some things I want to address here. There are two aspects of the Palestinian current situation which remain unspoken. The first relates to the internal situation under the Palestinian Authority and all of the details around it, and Dr. Mamdouh spoke of some of the major issues related to this matter, whether it be in the West Bank or in Gaza, and in particularly the legislation and laws that have been accomplished since the split and which affect different aspects of our life, and which is the theme of our conference today. The second level of the unspoken is more general and more particular in the same time, but it is not independent of the first level, and it raises a number of vital issues that affect mainly the change we want from the first level, but it is also unspoken in the public discussion, although it is a public affair par excellence. The second level here is characterized by high risk as regards its impact upon us, upon our children, our grandchildren, and their future in the near future. And probably because of this high risk and paradox vis-a-vis this theme, it is unspoken. I will come back to the second level in a while. For the first level, which is the theme of our conference today, the broader content of the legislation promulgated after the split is characterized by the collapse of the internal political regime, which is based on separation of powers, as it is stated clearly in the Palestinian Basic Law. And as a result of this, there was a merging of the legislative and executive authorities under a single authority, which is unpracticed even in the authoritarian regimes, which preserve a form of separation of these powers and engineer parliaments and opposition so that they do not appear inconsistent with the spirit of our era, or it may have lost the aspired political legitimacy which stems from these procedures and measures. we should not undermine the role of the opposition, which works within the political system, since this role is primordial because it monitors and oversees, it includes the monitoring and overseeing of the parliamentary majority and of the executive authority. In Palestine, we have created a unique model because we have two parliamentary oppositions existing in two geographically separated locations. There is an opposition of the West Bank, which usually exists in Gaza, and opposition of Gaza, which usually exists in the West Bank. And it could be said that the reason behind this is the occupation and the split impeded the operation of the PLC and refilled the legislative power to the executive authority. This common thinking is incorrect, or at least inaccurate. It is true that the split obstructed the Legislative Council as a body to convene to promulgate laws, and it prevented it from achieving a legal quorum of the Council, that is a simple majority of members as present in order to validate the decisions made by the PLC. But I have to remind you that parliamentary councils play two major roles. The first is to promulgate laws, and the second is to oversee the work of the executive authority. Although the split obstructed the first aspect of operation of the PLC in the West Bank, the split did not impede or prevent the PLC members from meeting and overseeing the executive authority and inviting ministers for hearing sessions and questions and answers, as it used to happen in the past Legislative Council, and to give their opinion regarding the business of the executive authority and requesting amendment to the action of the executive authority if needed. The split did not prevent the PLC or its members from playing this role without having a quorum. So what prevented the PLC members in the West Bank, or some of them at least, from performing this major task? Nobody knows. Whether the split provided a pretext for this ignorance or omission of a major task of the PLC, everybody knows, but probably particularly we listen to the largest bloc in the parliament, which is the bloc of Fatah, because it is the largest bloc, at least in the West Bank. And probably this bloc thought, since it is the party of the president, there is no need to oversee the legislation issued through a presidential decree, probably out of respect of the president, out of friendly relations, out of party or parliamentary decorum. But here there is a confusion of roles, because the PLC members in general, regardless of their affiliations or parties, represent those who elected them and do not represent the executive authority. And this what probably led partially to the current situation in the absence of parliamentary oversight and popular oversight on the said laws. And the same applies to Gaza. The members of the PLC in Gaza, most of whom represent Hamas, have been meeting to promulgate new laws, with not only without having a legal quorum, but also in clear contradiction in the roles and interests, because they promulgate laws, some of which stem, at least some of which stem from the executive authority, and they are the extension of this executive authority in the PLC. This could be a problem of a parliamentary system when the executive authority is formed of a party which has the majority in the PLC, and then we raise a question about the meaning of oversight role of the majority party in the PLC in overseeing what the executive authority is doing, which is an extension of this same party. That is, the party will oversee itself on its own. In all cases, whether it be in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip, the laws that have been enacted so far deepen the split, unfortunately, because bridging this split will mean going back to the efforts to reunite the laws between the West Bank and Gaza Strip after having been split for the mankind. But the second level that is unspoken in the public discussion, which is the political bottleneck of the Oslo track and its repercussions. As Dr. Mamdouh referred to an important aspect related to this issue, but here I will raise a question. What will happen next? What are we doing? What will we do with colonization and expansion of settlements and expropriation of land, Judaization of Jerusalem, and the threats against the Al-Aqsa Mosque and our natural resources and other aspects of life which remain under control of the Israeli authorities? This is the issue now. The Palestinians had not imagined that the ultimate goal of the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority is to act like a great municipality to manage the life of people on continual basis. And for this purpose, there were requests and appeals by many people who are keen to protect the national interest to call for the end of the split and to reform the PLO. However, although these requests are important, what remains unspoken is not that, but the answer to the question of what to do. And the answer, in my opinion, does not lie in ending the split and reforming the PLO, although this is very important. Because reforming the PLO and accession of Hamas and probably Islamic Jihad to the PLO will presume a major change in the current political track that is from endeavoring to preserve the negotiations and preserving the regional and international alliances and the relationship with Israel in the status quo to another track which is different. However, what is this track? Are we going to go back to a certain form of resistance? Whatever it is, can the PLO, especially its leadership, can it lead a track of this type while still under occupation? Where can the leadership of the PLO and the executive committee be outside the country? Is Tunis still an option? Cairo? Any other place? Where? Here, there are many questions which I cannot delve in now. Even if there is a place outside Palestine to host the PLO and its leadership so that it will not be politically subject to this place and enjoy certain level of independence. If resistance continues in Palestine as it will, there's no doubt. And resistance has not stopped. It's at different paces over the past years and since the occupation started. Will there, for example, be fear among the leadership abroad of the emergence of leadership inside Palestine? And this is the experience we have passed through before, and we have to learn lessons from this past experience. And probably this is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that led to the track of Oslo in the first negotiations. And there are many other questions. I think these issues have been neglected, but they are important and they need to be raised. So answer to these questions, in my opinion, should precede the end of the split, because bridging this break and fracture presumes that we change the current political track and then finding answers to these questions. All of the parties will not be prevented to address all of these issues without bridging this fracture. I believe there are so many reasons, but I will what I call the presidency of these issues. Identifying the possible choices is not an individual act, but it is a holistic national responsibility. It is true that we need to focus on the comprehensive level and the details and expect difficulties, but it also needs to be accompanied with responsibility and accountability and liability to any repercussions, as is the case in any system. Under these circumstances in particular, none of the possible choices other than going back to the track of negotiation will only be a militant act that will require sacrifices, even if the forms of this struggle are defined, it will still cost heavily. Meanwhile, there is a political authority, even if it is not a state, which is managing the life of a people on their land, in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and which legislates and enacts laws that govern the life of these people, who has the right to hold this authority accountable and to hold particularly accountable those who represent them, whether they have exercised the delegation authorized to them by those who gave them this delegation for this particular purpose. In this case, overseeing and analyzing the laws enacted from public interest perspective and leading a public discussion about them. However, where are we of this track and where is the PLC of this track? This is our topic for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. George. We will continue listening to the remaining papers, then we'll get into a joint discussion. I hope that now Dr. Ammar Dweik, law professor at BZ University, and I'm honored to say that he recently joined the Independent Commission for Human Rights as a Director General. The floor is yours, Dr. Ammar. Speak about the chaos of legislation between policies of for making public policies. Yeah. Now, I'm not speaking here in my capacity as Director General of the Independent Commission on Human Rights, but as a researcher only. Last year at Mواطن's 20th conference in this hall, I submitted intervention on the title A Legislation Without Legislators. And after I finished my intervention, the session moderator suggested to change its name into Legislators Without Legislation. And both, in fact, are true, because we have a large number of legislations, and we have legislation, and we have a large number of legislators. We have 132 legislators, or PLC members, in addition to what President mentioned before the UN when he said, I convey to you the position of the Palestinian Parliament, and here he was referring to the decision of the Central Council. I don't know their number. Added to whom the Palestinian Parliament, which is the National Council, that only God and scholars know about their number. I don't know if scholars are aware of their number. So we have many legislations and we have many legislators, but there is no connection between this and that. So legislation is issued from those who are not supposed to make legislations. Today we'll speak about legislations that were issued after the political division, and here I need to speak about legislation process since the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, and here I apologize for the repetition compared to my paper last year, but I consider this as an important introduction. Legislation in Palestine from formats starting with those who make legislation. Legislation, it had three basic stages in terms of who issues these legislations. The first stage, since 1994 until 1996, the election of the Palestinian Legislative Council, around 1 year and 8 months. During this stage, the legislative authority was the Palestinian Authority Council, which was composed of 25 ministers, headed by President Yasser Arafat, and they had the executive and legislative authorities where they issued 22 important laws. Some of them are still in place. The 22 laws issued by the president at that time, just to remind you, these include the publication law of 1995 until this day, the elections law based on which the 1996 elections and the communication law that is still in place today, and it is the one that established for the monopoly of the telecommunication companies and the investment encouraging law, which was amended. And this council remained active from a legislative point of view until the elections, which was established in January 19th. On that night, that is on the January 18th, 1996, two laws were established, issued, including the telecommunication law. The second stage, however, is the Legislative Council, the first and second council, that is having a legislative authority. In 1996, until the division in 2007, where 90 laws were issued. The third one, however, third stage, is the division one, where the legislator is the president, based on Article 43 of the Basic Law, that gives them the authority to decree laws in case of emergencies and not having a PLC in place or able to hold sessions. Now there is a great similarities between the three stages, and then there is a special peculiarity for the third stage. But allow me to speak about similarities between the three stages, although we have different legislators. The first one, in the form of legislation and issues of interest for legislation. If you look at 22 laws issued by the Council before 1996, during Yasser Arafat's time, and the 90 laws issued issued by the Legislative Council, and the 130 decreed laws by the President, there's a similarity in terms of interest into 3 or 4 issues, which is law, or the rule and institutions, government institutions, and establishing institutions, and the economic sector, while mainly focusing on major enterprises and neglecting or less interest in smaller institutions that make a majority of Palestinian enterprises. Also, in these three stages, there is lack of big interest in social legislation. Social legislations are very few across these three stages. For instance, civil status, social networks, law, they are very few in number. This includes the health insurance. They are very few compared to other legislations. Also, many important issues were avoided in legislation, such as the property or real estate law, the penal code, which is a very important one. So the three stages avoided these major stages. Throughout these stages, there is a great commitment to the Oslo Accords, and without any attempt to make a legislation that violates Oslo. There is a commitment to Paris Accords and all other agreements limiting or defining the authorities and jurisdiction of the Palestinian National Authority. Now looking at the powers behind these three legislations, non-official powers, they are repeated throughout these stages. The economic ones, stakeholders, I mean the main enterprises or major factories, by issuing the investment law that serves major companies and do not serve SMEs, the communication law, and amending the companies law to establish holding companies. So major companies, enterprises had an important role in that legislation. The bureaucratic apparatus of the executive played an important role in steering legislations in the three stages, and the international community and donors in placing their agendas by focusing or calling to focus on the rule sector in general, or governance sector. Also, we notice a lack, to a large extent, or absence of political factions. And there was a rule that was covered, their role was covered by the civil society that played a role that is bigger than that of the political factions. Also, there is a lack of a clear vision towards dismantling or ending that inherited colonial legislation that we inherited. A doctor from Birzeit University established Al-Muqtafi project where she found 12,000 different legislations prior to the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. These include military orders and legislations and others. So there is a great number of inherited legislations. These include around 1,600 military orders in place in the West Bank, and there is no intention to cancel them. Many of them were cancelled, but many of them are still in place, and there is not a clear vision that this is our plan to give up this colonial inheritance, legislative inheritance. And here comes the importance and significance of the theme of this conference, because legislation is not only a tool for making public policies, and it's not as Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, in his article towards studying a legal area, socio-legal area, he said legislation is not just a tool in the hands of the prevailing or ruling groups. But legislation, once it is born, it creates its own life and dynamics, and also establishes so by itself, it becomes an area by itself. This is the problem, that legislations that we produce, we don't know where they are taking us in the future. This is as related to the great similarity between these three stages in legislation. Now, the third stage, which we are going to focus today, is after the political division, where the president took over the legislative authority according to Article 43 of the Basic Law. We notice a significant legislative activity, and the legislative production is much more than what was produced by the Legislative Council in 10 years, in terms of activity, pace, and content. So legislative activities were really active. And let's look at this necessity condition as stated by the Article 43, giving this legislative authority to the President. Practically, this necessity now is required in all legislations, and now no one is discussing if this is necessary or not. And so there is no discussion about the relevance of this new legislation to a necessity condition. So any legislation issued by the President is issued by the President without anyone discussing. And now also there were legislations that were issued, promulgated by the President, decreed by the President, but they were not implemented. Because when a President issued a legislation for necessity, then it has to be implemented, such as the elections law. It was the first or second law decreed after the division. In 2007, then you would assume that there is a necessity to have elections next day, but until this day, it's not implemented. Also, the Communication Regulation Authority law, and it was issued in 2008, 2010, and until now, it has not been implemented. The Public Procurement Law was issued decreed in 2010, then amended in 2012, but without being implemented so far. So we are speaking about laws that are decreed for necessity, but you are surprised that they are not being implemented for different reasons. Also, we noticed that the President issued around 130 decreed laws since 2007. Not all of them are legislations. And he expanded using that decreed laws, so he started issuing decisions related to individuals, because the PLC is not only issues legislations, but it can also do monitoring and also give confidence to governments or endorse appointment of VIPs, such as the head of the Anti-Corruption Bureau, or the head of the monitoring authority or the pension authority, and also lifting immunity of the PLC members. In such cases, the president issued decisions with decrees or decreed decisions against individuals, such as that decision lifting immunity of Muhammad Dahlan, the legislator, and also appointing the head of the Anti-Corruption Bureau, and same thing for the monitoring the monitoring authority head, and many of such decisions that were issued since the division, and also decreed decisions endorsing national budgets. So this article has been expanded to include individuals, and now there is a decision before the Palestinian Constitutional Court, the High Court, related to Dahlan's case, and they said this is not a decreed law because a law must be a general and should not refer to individuals, and this was just a decision. So the idea is that expanding the use of that article is not limited only to legislations, but also to all powers and jurisdiction of the Parliament or Legislative Council. Looking at the legislations, we find the differences compared to previous stages. The most important one and the most dangerous one, based on which this conference is held, is the lack or absence of any deliberations or discussions before issuing or decreeing such laws. During the PLC times, the PLC would listen to many deliberations and interventions, inputs. I'll give you two examples, the labor law and the NGOs law. Many discussions were held with the stakeholders, and laws were issued after that, and I think they are very stable. The labor law is one of the most stable laws, and I don't expect to be amended soon, because when it was made, the views of different three parties were taken. Same thing with the NGOs law. But now, the dangerous part of that is that legislations are issued in dozens, much more than what was issued by the PLC without any deliberations or discussions. Most of them, around 70%, were issued without deliberations with stakeholders. So legislations are decreed while being affected by the interest of one stakeholder, the government or those lobbying for that, without taking into consideration the interests of others. And this is the most dangerous thing in legislation in the absence of the PLC. Also, there are deliberations on some legislations, and we noticed that such decreed laws that had large discussions and deliberations, such as the law to access information, and many of workshops were held, and there were 4 drafts, and such laws, including this one, were not implemented. Same thing, the law of governors. I contributed to the discussions on this law, and many discussions were held, but it was not issued. And the main reason here, and here's the problem with legislation during division time, when you put forward your law for discussion, then differences surface, and which is natural, but there is a lack of mechanism to manage these differences, which was done by the PLC, but now the law is paralyzed, and so the government is not issuing that law. The governor's law, there was a view between governors, and that is different from the civil society, and there was no mechanism to manage these differences, so the whole law was put on hold. Also, the other differences, the poor internal discussions or deliberations, like even laws that are issued, even the internal official departments that are which are stakeholders, but they are not being consulted, such as in the case of a law related to a higher education institution. The Minister of Higher Education at that time announced the law after it was decreed. Also, there was another decreed law for non-profit companies, So the Ministry of Company, the Ministry of National Economy only didn't know about the law before, until it was decreed. So even internal discussions or discussion between the presidency and the council of ministers is lacking or very poor. And there are things, such legislations that are discussed within the cabinet, but there are also legislations issued by the president. Sometimes they are sent for feedback from the council of ministers, and sometimes superficially sent to them to show that they were endorsed by the cabinet. But many legislations are issued through the president without the government stakeholders being aware or having enough time to see them. Also, non-commitment to a legislative plan. The government has its own legislative plan on a list of legislations to issue. So out of the 130 decreed laws, only 30 of these were part of the government legislative plan. And there are around 10 legislative or legislations were not issued, and the rest were issued without being on the list, government list. So this shows the issue of planning and how decisions and public policies are made. Also, the secondary legislations, and I think tomorrow's sessions will be on these legislation, the secondary ones, which are issued by the executive, bylaws and regulations, mostly are made more tough and give more authority to the government more than the regular legislations are done, as in the case of local entities or local government law, which allows the minister 28 powers and requires the local entities to refer for the minister for in 28 cases. According to this law, a number of regulations were issued, added another 30 other cases where local entities have to refer to the minister. So secondary legislations are not subject to consultations, and they increase the centralism of the central authority, and sometimes even they revoke some rights in the primary laws, such as in the case of charity organizations or NGO. Now, in case of legislation, now it's not clear at all how legislations or what are the official stages of making a legislation. There is not one format. Sometimes it's through the Council of Ministers, sometimes directly from the President's office, sometimes they include the Fatwa and Tashriya, sometimes there are legislations, sometimes it's presented or submitted to the parliamentary blocks, sometimes they consult the parties' political factions. There is no clear mechanism. So this left the space for two things. Number one, the executive is strengthening its hold over the legislation. And number two, although legitimate but limited interests are affecting legislations at the expense of other interests or larger interests. Now Palestine acceded the human rights interventions, 8 of basic conventions, and this requires repealing or cancelling or rewriting a large number of part of the Palestinian legislative system, and so this really brings up many concerns, such as the amended system by the Council of Ministers on non-profit companies. And in my view, it is an introduction to copy this on the civil society institutions. And the new system of the non-profit companies, which is a form of voluntary work and political and social participation. Then, although it takes a different form compared to the NGOs, the new system requires non-profit companies to get the prior consent of the Council of Ministers before they get any outside funding, regardless of the political context and who's interested in this amendment. The system did not specify the criteria based on which the Council of Ministers can endorse or reject that external funding. And so in the absence of such criteria, this means politicizing that decision. That if I have a non-profit company and apply for external funding, they might accept, and for my neighbor, they might reject. So there are no mechanisms, not a single mechanism on how to submit a request and what time, duration, and who looks into that. And if this system is really passed, then this will be a precedence to copy that to the NGOs, and there are some statements attributed to the Prime Minister, although denied. Nonetheless, there is no doubt that there is a form of hostility by the executive in dealing with the civil society institutions, a vision of competition, and at least we can describe it as hostile. In light of that vision, then legislations that are considered as achievement for the NGOs, such legislations are being amended, and which is a very dangerous issue. I will not speak for long. There are many issues that we can discuss during discussion, but I would like to point out here is that continuing with legislation in this chaos without enough social monitoring and without the legislators and PLC taking up their role brings up a great danger to many issues and to the social stability and to the rights of citizens. The Transparency International, in its annual report for 2 years, they added a new form of corruption. Usually they define corruption major and minor corruption, and they added a new form of corruption definition. They called it the political or legislative corruption, where an interest group takes the state institutions hostage for their own interest. Now, we cannot say that we are at that stage, but if the situation continues, we might be there. The last thing that I would like to say is now we notice conflicts, the role of conflicts within the bureaucratic regime in affecting legislations where a new legislation is created or amended to take a deputy minister, let's say, from a certain committee, or to include a certain deputy minister in a given committee. And there are examples that I don't want to mention now in detail, but it is there. So now, even legislation is being used to serve limited personal interests. Now, if you notice, the discussions around legislations, major part of these discussions, tend to give more privileges, not rights, such as the education law. It is one of important laws that all the Palestinian society must be engaged into creating them. Now there are discussions around them, and a major part of these discussions evolve around the salaries of teachers, which, although legitimate, but many legislations focus if the staff is part of the civil servants or not. And now also they are discussing another issue, which is the law of financial and administrative monitoring oversight authority, in order to increase or to have their salaries different from that of civil servants. Also, all the time they are speaking about establishing public institutions led by a minister. So, because of the impact of the executive, then influentials within the executive are having their influence over the legislation to serve their own personal interests.